Speaker. He's been here before. Mike Connelly, he's a constitutional attorney and the executive director of the United States Justice Foundation. He's a U.S. Army veteran. He got his JD from Louisiana State University, and he specializes in constitutional law. He's handled constitutional issues on most of the amendments, the first 10 amendments. And he's also an author. He's written 4 books, which are going to be back there by the table, which I look at. He writes a blog. He also has a weekly radio show on the internet called Our Constitution, where you can find out what the Constitution really means, and you should also come to tomorrow's learning to find that out. Anyhow, he's extremely well-qualified and expert in this, and one of the better-known constitutional attorneys in the United States. I'd like you to welcome Mike Connelly.
Thank you for having me again. This is, I think, my 3rd time here. You'll notice I never wear a tie. That's because when I stopped practicing law, I'm still licensed. I still do a lot of appellate work, but I don't have to wear a tie. It's right brief. And I threw away most of my ties, except for 2 of them. And I kept 2 of them particularly because I used them to irritate judges. There was a state district court judge in Baton Rouge who specialized in beating up on young attorneys. And when I was a young attorney, I didn't get intimidated by him, and that just irritated him no end. Years later, my wife and I started taking our children to Disney World on a regular basis, and it was always around Father's Day, was when our week was, and they bought me Mickey Mouse stuff. And Mickey Mouse shorts, Mickey Mouse bathing suit, Mickey Mouse socks, Mickey Mouse ties. Well, I started, every time I would go to Judge Bill Brown's courtroom, I would wear a Mickey Mouse tie, because that's sort of how I looked at his court, as a Mickey Mouse court. And everybody in the courthouse knew when I walked in the courthouse, they all looked to see what my tie was, because they knew if I had Mickey Mouse on it, I was going to Bill Brown's court. Then I had another tie I would wear in federal court in front of a particular judge. He and I did not get along very well. Of course, I never got along very well with anybody in the federal government particularly, and because I was always pushing the Constitution. And he, long before it was politically correct, decided that of the 6 flags that flew over the federal courthouse in Baton Rouge, one of them was a Confederate battle flag, and it had to be removed. So he had it taken down. So I got a tie one my sons gave me for Christmas with a Confederate battle flag on it. And I wore that every time I went in his courtroom. Now that was one way I irritated him. Another way I irritated him was to use a magic phrase. And he would just go ballistic whenever I used it. And that phrase is jury nullification. Federal judges, state judges do not like that phrase. They claim it doesn't exist, that it's not in the Constitution. I got news for you. That's what the Constitution was all about. Read it and read the Declaration of Independence. And you'll see that the jury system was set up specifically because people were being tried by the Crown under false pretexts, no laws used or laws made up as they went along, and no jury. They weren't having their guilt or innocence decided by their peers. In fact, a lot of times they were taken over across the ocean to be tried. So they knew what they were doing. And Madison talks about jury nullification. A lot of our founding fathers in some of their papers talk about jury nullification. That's what the jury system was all about. Yet you will not find it, unless you watch old Law and Orders on TV, you're not going to hear anybody talk about jury nullification, particularly not in the courtroom. I have friends of mine who have been held in contempt of court and actually thrown in jail for even mentioning the words in closing arguments to a jury. But it's there, and it's something that we have to start using more often, because we're going to have more and more people being tried in this country for doing absolutely nothing but supporting the Constitution. And it's going to get worse, and it's going to continue to get worse. We at the United States Justice Foundation do a lot of work on the Second Amendment, First Amendment, and particularly the Fourth Amendment. Because right now we have Big Brother looking at us from every angle. I figure on the Department of Homeland Security list of potential domestic terrorists, I fall into virtually every category. I'm a veteran, and we're on the top of the list. I believe in the Second Amendment. I believe in the right to life. I believe in the Constitution. I'm a strong supporter of the Bill of Rights. And by the way, if you've ever said that, you're on the list. So I figure I'm on their list completely. And we have a ranch out in Canton we bought now, and a small ranch, and my neighbor and I expecting drones to be over my head any time. And we've already set up a little place on the patio where we can sit there and shoot at them. So, but you know, this is something that's going to be happening in this country. The Fourth Amendment is being thrown out completely. The Fifth Amendment, due process, is being thrown out completely. Last time I was here, and I'll touch on this towards the closing of my remarks, but I talked about the veteran situation and how they're being denied their Second Amendment rights and their Fifth Amendment rights. We're making some headway on that. We're starting to win some individual cases. I've got a plaintiff here in Texas. In fact, he's right there in Canton. I'm going to be with him Tuesday, and we're going to be going forward with some stuff. Excuse me. I've done about 10 radio shows so far this week, so if my voice gives out and I start sounding like Donald Duck, just bear with me. But jury nullification is there. But you know, there's another aspect of nullification that is specifically in the Declaration of Independence, and that is basically the nullification by the people. In the Declaration of Independence, they talk a lot, Thomas Jefferson talks a lot about the reasons that the colonies, the states are seeking independence from Great Britain. And he starts putting out a laundry list of things that they are doing. And he said that when a government starts doing this to the people, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. That's what it says in the Declaration of Independence. And by the way, I've got this little booklet that I've written that a lot of you already bought copies of. It's on the Constitution. It's called Our Constitution. And it takes every article and every section, each amendment of the Constitution, put them in the way they're originally written, and then put in what they mean. I'm working now, I decided to write another little booklet on the Declaration of Independence, because I frankly hadn't read it in its entirety for a while. And I read it in its entirety before I was preparing for this speech today. And when you look at that laundry list, excuse me, of things that the Crown was doing to the colonists, to the American people, you look at what the reasons they cited for abolishing their relationship with Great Britain, and you can translate most of it into what's happening right here in the United States today. The President of the United States is doing some of the same things, a lot of the same things. Taxing us without consent of Congress, without our consent. Abolishing the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. Abolishing the Second Amendment to the Constitution. So I'm going to take each one of those and I'm going to put them in the little booklet, or maybe it'll just be an article on my blog. It depends on how long it is. But I'm going to put them in there, and I'm going to point out what's happening now as compared to what was happening then. Under the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution, all rights not designated, or all powers not designated as part of the powers given to the federal government, and they're very limited. That's what I point out in this little booklet. They're very, very limited. They were designed to be limited. Now, they've grown substantially, but in an unconstitutional way. Oh, thank you. The powers are limited both in Article 1 and Article 2 and Article 3. Article 1 sets up the Congress. Article 1, Section 8 says what the Congress can do, what laws it can pass, what areas it can cover. Healthcare is not in there. I pointed that out when I read the first version of the health care bill in 2009, all 1,100 pages, and wrote about it. And that's what really started my blog. So they're right there on its face, they're doing things that are unconstitutional. One of the things that is specifically given to Congress as a power is control of naturalization and immigration. Nowhere does it say the president can do that. Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution says the president must take care to see that laws passed by Congress are enforced. It doesn't say he can make new laws. It doesn't say he can change laws. It doesn't say he can stop enforcing laws. That's what he's done on immigration. Excuse me. I'm going to take up this gentleman's offer and take one of these cough drops. Let's try that again. But the President of the United States basically is violating his oath of office when he does something like refuse to enforce the immigration laws. His oath is basically the same one I took in the military to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. When he decides not to do that, he's committing an impeachable act. Excuse me again. I've written about that in my blog. I've actually given formal articles of impeachment to members of Congress, and they are now being considered by the House Judiciary Committee. So we need to contact members of Congress and tell them to vote those out on the House floor. It only takes a majority to pass articles of impeachment. Then there has to be a trial in the Senate. 2/3 majority has to vote to convict. That probably won't happen in the current Senate, but the reason we're pushing them with the United States Justice Foundation, and I'm pushing them personally, is because once they are adopted by the House of Representatives, the House will appoint people, prosecutors, special prosecutors will have extraordinary subpoena powers. They can go after the things that the president is trying to hide. They can interview and depose the people that were in Benghazi. They can cut through the red tape and get the documents for Fast and Furious, which, by the way, Eric Holder was ordered to turn over by a federal court 2 months ago and still refuses to do it. I mean, we have a lawless administration here, and more of the laws that are being passed by Congress are being ignored by the president. Congress passes some bad laws. They have been for years. But the president is enforcing those laws in ways that the Congress did not intend. Talk about the Second Amendment rights of veterans. Now they're coming after everybody. New BATF regulations, which we're fighting. New HHS regulations that we're fighting. The latest outrage is a new executive order and the EPA coming out and saying that they're going to ban AR-15 bullets, the most common ammunition. They're going to ban the manufacture of those in this country. Why? Because they say they're armor piercing. They're not. They've been tested. They're not armor piercing. But he's having the EPA ban them he's doing it by executive order. Unconstitutional. So what can we do about it? Nullification. Do what we have the right to do under the Declaration of Independence and under the Constitution. The states need to stand up and say, no, we're not going to allow this to go on. There are county sheriffs that are already standing up. One of them here in Texas that I met recently at a meeting in Las Vegas. There's a group called the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. It's run by Richard Mack. Richard Mack was a sheriff in Arizona back during the Clinton administration. And he sued the federal government. 6 other sheriffs joined in with him because that was when the Brady Bill was passed. And they wanted people to have the background checks before they could purchase a firearm. He said, not in my county, you don't. Because they told him he had to do it. And he was mandated by the federal government that local county sheriffs had to do the background checks. He refused. He said it violated his oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and guess what? The Supreme Court ruled in his favor. The Supreme Court has said that officers of the courts of this country, elected officials in this country, anybody who takes that oath cannot be forced to violate it. So the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association was set up by Sheriff Mack, and I'm one of their legal advisors, and they drew up a declaration which they're asking anybody can sign. You don't have to be a law enforcement, and you can find the declaration by going to my website, and my cards are back there on the table with the books, and you can go to my website, and by the way, there's a sign-up sheet if you want me to put you on the mailing list so that you'll be notified anytime I write a new article on my blog and post it. It's easy to sign up. Just give me your name and email address, and that list goes nowhere else. I don't do forwards. That's all you'll get from me. But there's an article on my blog called A Line in the Sand that I wrote right after this meeting where they drew up this declaration. Because basically what the declaration says is that we as sheriffs, and they specifically mentioned gun control, the Second Amendment, we as sheriffs will not enforce any gun control laws passed by the federal government in our county. And further, and this is where they really stick their neck out, we won't allow the federal government to come in and enforce it. Now that is nullification. And that is something they have an absolute right to do. And the states have the same right under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. 10th Amendment says that, if it's not mentioned in the Constitution as a power belonging to the federal government, it belongs to the states, it belongs to the people. That's what the 9th and 10th Amendment are all about. As far as I'm concerned, I have a strict construction of the Bill of Rights. Because in my little booklet, you'll find something that you most don't see in most history books, or where they put in the Bill of Rights or the entire Constitution. And that's the preamble to the Bill of Rights. Not just the preamble to the Constitution. I had to memorize that when I was in school. But this is a preamble to the Bill of Rights. And basically, if you look at that, it is a warning to the federal government issued by the Founding Fathers saying, okay, you know what you can do now, but you can't mess with this Bill of Rights. Because these are God-given rights. They're not given to us by the federal government, and therefore the federal government cannot take them away. Amen. That's right. Now, the illustrious governor of New York says that's not true. Well, he claims he personally gives people rights and can take them away. You make a good Democratic candidate for president, I think. But that's not the fact of the matter. The fact is that as far as I'm concerned, and Mark Levine, and I agree on not on everything, but I do agree with Mark Levine when he says Congress should not even be voting on anything to do with changing the Second Amendment. All the gun control legislation passed by Congress, as far as I'm concerned, is null and void. And that's where nullification comes in. State legislatures can come in and say, we are not going to allow registration of firearms in our states. We are not going to allow background checks to be enforced in our states. They have the right to do this. Now, obviously, you're talking about verging on civil war here. That probably is coming anyway, unless the states can stand up for us. Because eventually it's going to get to the point where the people are going to look at this Declaration of Independence and say, you know what? We got to do it all over again. We have a right to do it all over again under the Declaration, and we're going to do it all over again. Because we're being set up right now. As a former military intelligence officer, I belong to a group that meets about once every 2 months. And we have former CIA, FBI, military intelligence, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, Secret Service, and we're all retired from that. We get briefings, intelligence briefings. And we not supposed to talk about outside the room what we hear. But I can tell you it's very scary. And the idiocy that's been going on for the last 3 days, this summit on terrorism or extremism, I forced myself to listen to the President of the United States and what he has to say. And what he had to say was basically, apologize for the people that are out there trying to kill us. Apologize for them and apologize to them for us. We're facing severe consequences as far as terrorism in this country. We're not getting hit hard right now, but I think it's going to come. And when it does, my fear is that the president will use that to impose martial law. And that's where this nullification comes in again. The states could say, not in our state. The state of Texas says, we're not going to impose martial law. We're not going to let you come in here and impose martial law. It's tantamount to seceding from the Union. But that may be what we have to do. Because if martial law is successfully imposed, it will never be lifted. We will never have another free election. Our guns will be taken away. I saw this in New Orleans. I grew up in Baton Rouge and spent quite a bit of time in New Orleans. Right after Hurricane Katrina, when they went in and they confiscated, they kicked down doors and they took people's weapons away. At a very time when crime was rampant, when the looters were all over the place, and people that had their homes secured were fearing for their homes, the feds went in there and with local authorities and kicked down doors and confiscated weapons. And they weren't going to give them back. So guess what? The United States Justice Foundation joined a lawsuit, and we won. And we got all the weapons back for people, and it was declared unconstitutional what they had done. So that's another nullification. We can try to do it by the courts. Right now, what happened here in Texas a couple of days ago, when a federal judge threw out the amnesty plan of Obama's. That is a landmark. Here's the key. It has to be upheld in the Fifth Circuit, and we'll be filing an amicus brief in the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court, because it's going to go to the Supreme Court. It has to be upheld by the Fifth Circuit, and it has to be upheld by the Supreme Court. If it's not, if the Supreme Court does not uphold that federal judge's ruling, they're basically going to be saying the Constitution is done. That the President of the United States now has no limitations on him whatsoever. He can do anything he wants. He's doing that pretty much anyway. But can you imagine what would it be like if the Supreme Court says, yeah, it's okay for you to totally violate the Constitution, for you to make new laws, decide which ones to enforce and which ones not to. All of that's just fine. As I see it at that point, we're done as a constitutional republic. And that's the point where the states are going to have to, again, do something. Legislatures around the country are introducing legislation to do things like throw out concealed weapons permits, allow open carry. Here in Texas, that's very important. It's very important they allow open carry in Texas. It's very important they allow students to carry weapons on college campuses. I am so tired of gun-free zones and seeing people get killed in gun-free zones. That's where it happens 90% of the time. That's why it happened at Fort Hood, because our military bases were made gun-free zones by President Clinton. Only the MPs are allowed to carry weapons. We're the only country in the world that does that. And there have been 2 massacres at Fort Hood now as a result of it. Where are most of the terrorist attacks taking place? Malls, where they're gun-free zones. Schools, which are gun-free zones. Universities, which are gun-free zones. Some of the states have had legislation introduced basically saying that no more gun-free zones in our state. Period. And the federal government can't tell us we have to have gun-free zones. So we need to talk to our legislators here, and you need to talk to the local sheriff here, and get your friends in other parts of Texas and other states to talk to the local sheriff. Get them to go on a website, or they can go directly to the Constitutional Sheriff and Peace Officers Association website. Sign that declaration. Become a part of that group. Vow that you will not allow tyranny in your county. The more we vow that, the more our elected officials take that vow, the more we take that vow, the less powerful and less successful they're going to be when they actually try to do it to us. But I'm talking about the federal government completely taking away our rights. We don't have that many left. I mean, they're trying to, take over the internet now. The bastion of free speech for the conservative movement is the internet. We're certainly not going to get anything on NBC. They're not even going to talk about a lot of things. They're going right along with the president saying that, there is no such thing as Islamic terrorism. My oldest boy spent 94 months in combat since 9/11. Don't tell him there's no such thing. He fought the Taliban 4 times in Afghanistan. He fought the Sunnis in Iraq. He was even in Pakistan at one point. But we don't talk about that because he wasn't supposed to be there. But he can tell you who we're fighting. And the idea that the Taliban is not a terrorist organization. Why did we go into Afghanistan in the first place? Because that's where Al-Qaeda was based. That's where their headquarters was. That's where their training camps were. They were in there training people to kill Americans, and we're doing it. So we went in, we kicked out the Taliban. Now Obama's going to let them right back in again. That void that he left in Iraq, we see what's happening there. It's been filled up by Islamic terrorists. But don't despair. Remember, Obama told us just before the 2012 election that he had personally wiped out Al-Qaeda, that we had nothing to fear. Somebody showed me a cartoon the other day that says, if Obama is alone in a forest, it says something, when nobody's around, we'll still be alive. I think that's a pretty good question, because that's all he does. I mean, that's all the man does. He lies to the point where he lies when it's to his advantage to tell the truth. But we're getting now to the point where he's committing treason.
Amen.
And my latest article on my blog, and I encourage people to read this, we're getting a big response to this thing. It's entitled Aid and Comfort. And I point out that in the Constitution, the definition of treason includes providing aid and comfort to the enemy. It doesn't have to be direct aid. It can just be support, directly or indirectly. And I list in there 16 things that the President of the United States has done to provide aid and comfort to our enemies. The latest being yesterday. I'm a former military officer. There's a lot of ex-military out there, I know. And all of us know one thing from the military. One particular point of strategy and tactics. You don't send a note to your enemy saying, we're going to attack you here tomorrow. And we're going to use these forces. Obama did that yesterday when the Pentagon put out what we're going to do in May in Mosul. We're going to attack you. Here's who's going to attack you. Here's how we're going to attack you. I don't think the Iraqi army is going to go now. If I was them, I would say, the heck with this. You just told them where we're coming from. The sorties we're flying against the ISIS. Experts say that we are to be effective, the military to have an effective campaign in the air, and just the air was not going to do it. But we need to be flying 240 a day, sorties against the enemy. We're averaging 24 a day. Last week, there was one day we did 2. And from what I'm hearing from my sources in the military, Obama and his people are micromanaging the attacks. Every target has to be approved by Obama or one of his appointees, none of whom are in the military, have ever been in the military. So you know what we're doing? We're bombing a lot of empty buildings at night. We're blowing up a lot of parked pickup trucks. He didn't want to hurt anybody. He didn't want to kill the people who are trying to kill us. But they've come up with a solution. They're going to parachute in jobs. With B-52s, we just drop parachutes with jobs. It's getting tough out there, ladies and gentlemen. But we need to push our states and our local governments to stop violating the Constitution, because many of them are doing it just as much as the federal government. We need to elect people who will stand up and say enough is enough. And yes, we will not do what you're telling us we have to do. We will not allow you to even tell us.
Right.
Cite the Constitution. Read the Constitution. That little booklet of mine, you know, people take it or carry it around all the time. A lot of people order for schools and churches to give out. And, you know, I carry around a pretty beat up copy because I found out that it's very good. If you're arguing with a liberal and they say something stupid, you can either point out what's in the Constitution or you just whack them with it. It's important that we get more meetings like this going, we get more people. I'm going around speaking. I've got speaking engagements just piling up now. Been all over the country doing them. And if you have an organization you want me to speak to, I've spoken to the Rotary Club here in Tyler. I've spoken to Lions Clubs, Tea Party groups, Republican groups. And so I'm willing to keep doing that because we got to get the word out. So many people out there don't know what's going on. If they don't know what their rights are, they're not going to know when they're losing them. And that's what we're facing. Our kids are being taught about the Constitution. They're not being taught about the Declaration of Independence. In North Carolina, yeah, it was a North Carolina school. They had a school here recently where all the children were forced to recite the Pledge of Allegiance in Arabic and say, "One nation under Allah." You know, that in Texas here, some girls were forced to wear burqas to class one day. I mean, nobody's talking about what is really out there, what Sharia law really is. And that's something else we need to nullify, nip it in the bud. This state needs to follow what Oklahoma's done. If we have to amend our Constitution, let's amend our Constitution and say no Sharia law under any circumstances. And the legislature needs to outlaw that tribunal that they've just set up for Sharia law. Because if you don't know what Sharia law is, let me tell you, first of all, there's no rights for women. Under Sharia law, a man cannot be convicted of killing his wife or his daughters if it's an honor killing, if they've done something to embarrass him. And the honor killing we had here in Texas a few years ago, 2 girls were killed because they were wearing Western clothing. And the father said, that's an honor killing. Now this tribunal says it's not going to be doing criminal law. Well, let's wait and see. But civil law, if you are a non-Muslim, an infidel, and by the way, I just bought a t-shirt that says armed infidel. I'm pushing the envelope here a little bit. But if you are an infidel and you have a contract with a Muslim, and that contract says that any breach of contract or any dispute must be resolved under Sharia law, then you would have to go to this tribunal. But let me tell you what happens when you go on that tribunal. It is automatically assumed that as an infidel, you lie about everything. So it doesn't matter what you testify to, you're going to lose. That's Sharia law. Now, we have had legislation pending in the House of Representatives, signed by 83 female members of Congress, pending since 2009. And it's never been brought up for a vote. And it basically outlaws Sharia law in federal courts in this country. Because I don't trust Eric Holder. And by the way, what I'm finding out about this new appointee, Loretta Lynch, I think it is, you know, she's going to be worse than Holder if she's not in jail by the time the appointment goes through, because she's under a criminal investigation right now. But my fear is that they'll just start allowing Sharia law. I mean, look what happened in Oklahoma. 70% of the people of Oklahoma voted to amend their constitution to outlaw Sharia law and Sharia courts. They were sued by a Muslim involved with CARE, which, by the way, is a front for Hamas. And joining in that lawsuit was Eric Holder in the Justice Department. Again, we need to nullify this sort of thing. We need to do it through our state legislatures. We need to do it through our courts. If you're sitting on a jury and you're seeing somebody's constitutional rights being violated, you need to vote to acquit that person. That's what jury nullification is all about. More importantly, in a civil case, if you see injustice being done by the courts, then you need to vote the way your conscience is telling you to vote, not necessarily how the judge tells you you have to vote because this is the law. Because the law is us. We are the law. The Declaration of Independence says it, that we are the ultimate judges, the ultimate arbitrators of what goes on in this country and what doesn't go on in this country. We're the ones who decide how we live our lives and how we let other people live theirs. The Declaration simply says that we have the right to alter or change our form of government. People are talking about, we need a constitutional convention, rewrite the Constitution, that sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with the Constitution. The Constitution says what we want it to say. But when you don't enforce the Constitution, when nobody pays attention to the Constitution, when they think they can alter it, courts can alter it with a stroke of the pen. Obama can do it with a stroke of the pen. Then that's when we're in trouble. And that's when we need to take a serious look at what our next steps are going to be. So I've rattled on enough. I'll answer some questions now. Well, by the way, I need to tell you a true story that I heard the other day. This happened in Canton, Texas a couple of weeks ago. And there was a Sunday school teacher teaching a group of little 6-year-olds. And she was going to start talking about the resurrection. And she started off by asking, anybody know what resurrection means? And everybody kind of stared at her blankly, these little kids. And finally one little boy raised his hand. He says, I don't really know what it means, but I know if it lasts more than 4 hours, you have to see a doctor. That's a true story.
Am I on? Okay. Define jury nullification and how do we use it?
Well, jury nullification, basically, if you've ever been on a jury, you know that the judge is the attorneys are going to present their evidence, and then they will make their closing arguments. And then the judge will give instructions to the jury. And those instructions will be what the law is. And sometimes the judge will say, if these are the facts, you find these facts, you must acquit. Or you must find the person guilty. Or you must find this person liable for that automobile accident. Basically, most juries are set up in most states where the juries decide the facts and the judges decide the law. But a lot of places, the judge just tells you what the law is and how you have to interpret that law. Jury nullification means that you do not have to follow that just because the judge said so. You have a right to vote your conscience the way you want to vote on a jury. And if it's contrary to what the judge says the law is, that's too bad. The jury is supposed to have the final say-so. That's how the jury system was set up. The jury system was supposed to have the final say-so. And they had situations in the past where prosecutors have been trying to put somebody in prison for bogus charges. And they make it look like that person broke the law, and they're saying this is what the law is, and juries have actually come and found the person not guilty, despite being told they had to find them. That's what jury nullification is.
Has the administration provided any documents regarding Fast and Furious?
Very few, and most of them that they provided were several years ago, and they were redacted to the point where you couldn't read them. And by the way, we have 4 lawsuits going right now, preparing 4 lawsuits against the federal government for refusing to answer our Freedom of Information Act request on veterans situations. And we need to raise some money from the United States Justice Foundation. We're spending an awful lot of money. So there's a card back there where you can send a contribution, U.S. Justice Foundation. We don't charge all the military members we're representing. We're not charging them a penny. We don't charge anybody to represent them. We raise our money independently. We need about $10,000 right now in the next couple of weeks so I can help this guy out in Canton, because this veteran's just getting hammered. They're taking away his Second Amendment rights, basically because he had his bills paid by an automated system through the bank. And they found on that basis, and the basis alone, he was incompetent to handle his own financial affairs. And once you're declared incompetent, then you can no longer own firearms in this country. And they're kicking down doors. They had a Navy veteran in New York that his door kicked in recently. And why was he found incompetent by the state of New York and federal government? He was being treated for insomnia.
I think the businesses which don't want to serve some others based on their religious beliefs should refuse to obey judgments against them by courts which want to force them to do so. What do you think?
I agree. And because freedom of religion is extremely important in this country. It's in the First Amendment. It's something that can't be tampered with by the federal government. And when you tell somebody that they have to violate their religious beliefs just to be politically correct, I don't care what a judge says. If I was a business owner, I would shut down the business and just refuse to obey. You know, it's called civil disobedience. And we need more of that, I think.
I'm afraid so.
If and when federal martial law happens, will Texas be in the crosshairs first, inasmuch as Texas seems to be in the lead against federal takeovers?
Texas is already in the crosshairs. I mean, the EPA is running rampant here, trying to shut down our industries. The border is being left wide open so that criminals can come in. And we got ISIS cells in El Paso. We know that for a fact. We got ISIS cells in El Paso. So we're already in the crosshairs, and yes, it's just going to get worse under martial law. At that point, you know, Texas would, best thing Texas could do is just seal our border, period.
Amen. How can citizens nullify the Affordable Care Act? How would they avoid the penalties imposed by the federal government?
The Affordable Care Act is such a mess to begin with. You know, they're just about nullifying it on their own. Our best bet right now is still in the courts with the Affordable Care Act. Or the states are doing what they can by saying not setting up exchanges, and that will bring it to its knees. If the Supreme Court rules the way we think it's going to rule, that federal exchanges cannot insure people in the states that don't have their own exchanges, then the whole system's going to crash. So the states need to hold the line there, and there's 26 states, I think, that have filed are involved in this lawsuit now, and so I think that's the key at this point is the courts when it comes to the Affordable Care Act.
I read all the questions, and I just want everyone to know that. So if something seems repetitive, it's because we read all the questions. If I set it down, you might wonder why. How can we legally opt out of Obamacare?
Certain religions are entitled to opt out. Certain people, certain religions. It doesn't really specify what those religions are. But if you have specific religious beliefs that would keep you from being involved in Obamacare and that type of thing, then I would go ahead and ask to be let out and, you know, make the move. As far as opting out completely, there are people that are right now just refusing to sign up. They're going to pay the penalties. You know, that's yeah, pay the penalty. And because if enough people just refuse to sign up, then eventually it's going to fall on its own. And Congress needs to do something. I mean, Congress needs to get involved. They're just sitting on their hands right now. We were promised that they were going to repeal Obamacare. We know as long as Obama's in there, repeal's not going to work because he's just going to veto it. But Congress still controls the purse strings. I think right now, I think you're going to see a lot more activity on Obamacare after the Supreme Court decision is made, depending on how it goes. Because if they do decide that that part of the law is unconstitutional, then Congress at that point can basically wipe it out. So,
Is the privately owned Federal Reserve families unconstitutional?
privately owned what?
Federal Reserve families? I'm not sure what that meant.
Not sure either.
Is that person here?
Right here. I'm curious, the Federal Reserve that controls basically the purse strings, should that not be under the auspices of the Congress and not the Federal Reserve Chairman?
Are you talking about the Federal Reserve?
Yes, I'm just wondering if the Federal Reserve, in its origin and where it sits right now, is it constitutional or not in your mind?
There's a lot of people that say it is unconstitutional because the Federal Reserve basically is a so-called independent organization and is really not under control of Congress. And yet they are making the decisions for our economy. So I think that I agree with Ted Cruz and other members of Congress that think the first thing we ought to do is audit the Federal Reserve. Find out how they're spending all this money and what the heck they're doing. And so I think the Federal Reserve needs to be seriously looked at.
What can be done to protect our Fourth Amendment rights against the TSA screeners?
The TSA screeners are, getting out of hand too. And there are more and more sophisticated ways that they're looking at people. But until the courts rule it unconstitutional, or until Congress changes the way the screening goes, there's really not much you can do other than refuse to go into one of the scanners, and then they pat you down and this sort of thing. Right now that is the law of the land, and it has not been declared unconstitutional. It hadn't really been challenged, frankly, and I don't understand why. Because we had one person that we were going to challenge it for at one point, and then he chickened out on us. So, again, that's something that really needs to be resolved in the courts. Because I think that in a lot of ways it violates the Fourth Amendment. In a lot of ways it's good, because they do have ways now to find out if in your luggage, for example, that bottle of scotch is not a bottle of explosives. And they can differentiate that now by just looking through luggage. So, we got the privacy issues out there, but unfortunately we also have the security issues.
We impeached Clinton and he stayed. Why pursue impeachment?
Well, again, the reason for impeachment in my mind is to get the information out. And there's two things that will happen if we impeach Obama. Number one, like I said, we get the special prosecutors to start getting all this information that's been hidden. But number two, the man's got 2 years left in his term if he intends to allow us to have elections in 2016. He's got 2 years left in his term. He's going to do a lot of damage during that period with executive orders and everything. And my articles of impeachment specifically talk about how executive orders violate his oath of office and violate Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution. If we have him under the gun being tried in the Senate, and that'll take about 1.5 years to 2 years for all that to be done, then the smart thing for him to do, and he doesn't impress me to be particularly smart, the smart thing would be to stop issuing executive orders, because you're just going to make it worse. And if we keep him busy not, looking for things to do to us and defending himself, put him on the defensive. The man has had us on the defensive for 6 years. I think it's time we put him on the defensive. Go after it. Somehow go after it. Because right now he's being emboldened. He thinks he can do anything he wants. Congress is not doing anything to him. Only that ruling by the federal judge here in Texas has stopped anything so far.
There is a Sharia law center in Richardson, Texas. Is this center being challenged in court?
Well, the Sharia Law Center is the one that's setting up this new Islamic tribunal. And you can't really challenge them in court because under freedom of religion, they're entitled to have a center set up. It's a cultural center. So they have their First Amendment rights too. What's not being done is they're not looking at the people there. They didn't look at this conference that was there a couple of months ago, where a lot of Tea Party people went out there and protested because the Garland School District gave them a building to hold a conference on Sharia law. And in fact, it was right after the killings in Paris that they held this. As long as they're paying their taxes, or they're a nonprofit, they're set up and recognized by the state, there's not much the state can do about it, and because of First Amendment issues. But we have to keep an eye on these people. I mean, we had people sitting at that summit in the last 2 days who are known terrorists and terrorist sympathizers, and the President of the United States was pandering to them.
What is the single most important thing, beside casting our ballot, that we can do as citizens to alter the current state of affairs?
Educate people, support groups that educate people, support getting the word out to people, because, I'm always preaching to the choir, and I enjoy that, but I like it even better when I get up in front of people that don't know what's going on, and I talk about what's happening to our veterans, and everybody freaks out. They can't believe it. How can that be going on? They haven't heard in the mainstream media. They're not hearing the truth about the amnesty in the mainstream media. They don't know, and I talk about here in Texas what we see on that border every day and who's coming across that border. They don't know that. They don't know that in Alabama. They don't know that in Mississippi. They don't know that in Illinois. We need to get the word out. We need to get more people out on the stump. We need to talk to our friends. We need to talk to our relatives. And we need to support groups like the United States Justice Foundation that are trying to get the word out, because we're an educational as well as a legal firm. And because, like I said, I'm aghast that when I talk to groups, they don't even know what I'm talking about. When I talk about the 10th Amendment, I get blank stares.
Can't Sheriff Ray in Canton keep the veteran you want to represent safe from being declared incompetent?
No, because that's right now the federal government can do it. So he can't keep the veteran from being declared incompetent. Now, if they come and try to confiscate his weapons, the sheriff then can intervene. And we've actually had this happen in a couple of locations around the country. The sheriff can say, nope, not in my county, you can't. You're not going to touch this man's weapons. And I'm going to talk to this veteran about what he's got and this sort of thing, and start figuring out how to protect him. Right now, we're going to be going forward with his case because we have to exhaust his administrative appeals, and we're going to be doing that as quickly as we can. And then we'll be able to file a lawsuit on behalf of him and hundreds of other veterans we're representing around the country.
What do you mean if he allows us to have an election in 2016? Are you being facetious, or is there a basis for the comment?
I wish I was being facetious. We have a president of the United States who is acting as a dictator. I mean, he considers himself a dictator. He's an elitist. He's narcissistic. Some of the comments made by the State Department official recently about the jihadists and not using the term and this sort of thing. She indicated that peons like you and I, we don't understand the nuances of what she was trying to say. I understood exactly what she was trying to say, but we're considered to be the unwashed masses, and the president doesn't think we're smart enough to handle our own affairs, or we're smart enough to be allowed to own firearms. He's got an agenda. He's not going to complete that agenda in 2 years. If he can find a way, either through martial law or something like that, to stop the election from taking place in 2016, particularly if it looks like somebody he controls, like Hillary Clinton, is not going to win, I'm afraid he'll do it. I mean, I'm looking back at Mein Kampf, a book I read when I was a teenager by Adolf Hitler. And I look at what Adolf Hitler did when he became Chancellor of Germany. He wanted to consolidate himself as a dictator. It took a few years to do it. First thing he did was completely nationalize health care. Figured if I could control access to health care, I could control the people. Second thing he did was start to disarm the German people, beginning with the veterans, because they had taken essentially the same oath of office to their country that I took to mine. And you had a lot of World War I veterans out there who were armed and believed in their country. Then he started purging members of the military who were not loyal to him and him alone. We've seen a lot of high-ranking officers being purged. Now a lot of lower-level officers and non-coms are being given their pink slips because of budget cuts or so on and so forth. In the meantime, Obama's got the recruiters out there actively recruiting illegals to join our military. I wonder if they're going to have to take the same oath I took. But we know who they're going to be loyal to. And then something else that Adolf Hitler did was start using mental illness as a weapon to silence people. That's being done right now to our veterans, to others. And if you go to my blog, you'll find a lot of information on all this.
What can be done about all of the bureaucratic civil service employees who make and enforce regulations, and these people do not come and go as new presidential administrations and new Congresses?
Well, we have to do what Ronald Reagan started when he was elected president. And that was, he went in there and he started getting rid of a lot of these low-level bureaucratic agencies. Obama, of course, created a whole bunch of new ones by illegally appointing czars to handle whole new departments. And that was unconstitutional because none of those were confirmed by the Senate. But what Reagan did, and I was on Reagan's campaign staff, and I worked with him and a lot of his staff members very closely. He told, and the Congress was doing this on its own to a certain extent, but he told his people to look at every federal agency, even if it was just a cubbyhole in a sub-agency, and find out what they were doing and what their budget was. And as a result, they found things like 35 different agencies doing exactly the same thing. Well, he got rid of 34 of them. He closed them down. He significantly reduced the size of the federal government in the 8 years he was president. We need to get Congress to start doing that right now, because Congress is supposed to be in charge of all this. They're supposed to oversee the executive branch. And that means all the agencies. And Congress needs to start doing its job.
Can you explain the law about taking people's guns away if they have their bills automatically paid? Does this include what many people use to have merchants automatically deduct the bill from their accounts?
Pretty much similar to it. Let me give you briefly what is going on with this. Veterans are getting this letter saying, from the VA saying you're going to be declared incompetent to handle your own financial affairs because of your physical or mental disabilities. Now, fiduciary would be appointed to represent you. That fiduciary law has been around a long time. It was designed for elderly veterans who might be suffering from dementia and couldn't pay would forget to pay their bills and would forget to cash their benefits check, this sort of thing. It's rarely used, but it used fine. Well, they started back in 2007 when Congress passed an amendment to the Brady bill, to the National Gun Registration Bill, which said that more people had to be put on there if they were determined, adjudicated to be mentally ill to the point of being a danger to themselves or others. Adjudication means a hearing, or used to. And these veterans are being told for physical or mental disabilities. And then they are being held to be incompetent because they have minor PTSD, because they might have been depressed at one time over the loss of a buddy, because they let their spouses pay the family bills, because they use an automated bill paying system to pay their bills. And I've got the letters from the VA. We have a woman in Virginia who is the widow of a man killed in Vietnam. And they sent her a letter specifically telling her that's the reason they were declaring her incompetent, because she was an automated system. But then that letter goes on to say, once you have been found incompetent, you can no longer own, possess, purchase, or transport firearms or ammunition. If you do, you're guilty of a felony. So we have now about 200,000 veterans on the NICS list for being declared incompetent, because Eric Holder decided that being incompetent, once you were declared incompetent for any reason whatsoever by the federal government, you were automatically mentally ill to the point of being a danger to yourself or others. And that's why they're being put on that list. 99.9% of them don't belong there. So it's a horrendous situation. But they're finding every excuse, and they're extending it now to the civilian population. I recently talked to someone very close to me who was getting on Medicare for the first time and went to see a doctor. And this was right here in Texas. And the doctor apologized because he told her, you have a bunch of questions you have to answer. Federal government requires me to ask these questions. A lot of them were just general health type questions. But there was one in there that says, do you own a firearm? So you think they're not as a civilian population? You'll be getting those letters from Social Security next thing you know.
I hope I get this last question right. Explain prosecutorial discretion related to the Constitution.
Well, basically, that's something that allows a prosecutor to have great discretion over whether or not to actually file charges against somebody. And it's been abused. The Attorney General designee is being investigated right now for violating that prosecutorial discretion by letting some people off the hook that shouldn't have been let off the hook. But it's pretty widespread. It's why, for example, district attorneys cannot be sued unless they deliberately go after somebody that they know is innocent. They can't be sued for prosecution, even if the person is found innocent. So that basically is what it is in a nutshell. It's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but that's the way it's been determined to be under the Constitution in general.
I've heard that used as a way for determining what battles they want to fight within the Attorney General's office.
Yeah, well, the Attorney General's office uses it all the time. And they use it to determine which battles to be fought. But the thing is, the Attorney General works for us. So we ought to have some say-so in what they do and don't do. And that's something that we've lost. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll be back.